"Who do people say I am?" The disciples answered, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." And those were good answers, complimentary to Jesus. But they didn't go far enough. If Jesus were only John the Baptist, or Elijah, or one of the prophets, he would just be one of the great ones among many. Hardly one of a kind, and hardly the Son of God. Hardly the one to split history in half. But then Jesus asked, "But what about you? What do you say I am?" If you go back and read the original Greek, the word "you" is emphasized. But you, who do you say I am? The disciples had been with Jesus for long enough to form an opinion, to understand that Jesus was more than just another great man. But you, who do you say I am? Peter answered. He said, "You are the Messiah." What did that mean? What did that mean? It meant that Jesus was the Messiah, the one for whom Israel had waited for so long. The one who would return them to greatness. As we all know, Israel had once been great, hadn't it? Under King David, they were a great nation. And when David was king, nobody messed with Israel. At least, not more than once. Israel, under David, was a force to be contended with. A great nation, mighty in battle, and prosperous in peace. When David was king, there were no Roman soldiers wandering the streets with authority to require Israeli citizens to carry their luggage. But that was long ago, and Israel's flower had faded. Now Roman soldiers were everywhere, sent to protect Roman tax collectors and Roman governors. And the Israelis, they hated that. They hated seeing their money siphoned off to Rome. They hated answering to a Roman governor. And they hated Romans telling them what to do. They hated not being great. And when Peter said, "You are the Messiah," he meant that Rome's days were numbered. That Christ would get Israel organized, raise an army, drive out the Romans, put God's people back on top. But Jesus, he surprised his disciples with his next words. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer and be killed and then rise again. And the disciples could hardly believe what they were hearing. Now Peter, who was always the first to speak, he took Jesus aside and he began to rebuke him. He must have thought that Jesus was just having a bad day and that he needed some encouragement. I can imagine Peter putting his arm around Jesus and saying, "Jesus, get a grip. You can't go around talking like that. It upsets the disciples, and we left everything to follow you. You can't let us down now. This talk of a cross, well, it's foolishness, Jesus. It's just foolishness." That's correct, of course. Exactly correct. The talk of a cross is foolishness. Paul said so in his letter to the Corinthian church. "How can anyone solve anything by dying," he said, "except, perhaps, by dying heroically? No one can solve anything by dying shamefully. And there was no more shameful death than the death on the cross." But Jesus, he often turns things upside down, doesn't he? Remember when he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn"? Jesus' talk of the cross was like that. Death on the cross was indeed foolishness, but in God's hands, it became wisdom. Jesus' death transformed the cross into a symbol of God's love. The cross didn't make sense, except in God's new math, where it added up perfectly. And Christians, living in the shadow of Jesus' cross, we have been bearing our own crosses ever since. Back in the first centuries, Romans lined the roadsides with crosses to kill Christians. And as time progressed, people found new ways to kill Christians, didn't they? They were burning them at the stake, they were beheading them. You know, given the persecutions that Christians have endured, you would think that there wouldn't be any Christians left. But the opposite is true, isn't it? It is. Christ is alive and well in the hearts of men and women throughout the world. Christ is alive in places where authorities have made every effort to crush our faith. Christ survived Hitler. Christ survived Stalin. Christ survived Mao. Christ is alive in Cuba. Christ is alive in Vietnam. And Christ is alive in East Timor. You know, Christ is alive in those hostile places because Christians have outlived their persecutors. They haven't outlived them in years, but in the quality of their lives. People have seen tyrants hating and Christians loving, and they have been drawn to the lovers rather than the haters. We Christians, we live according to Christ's teachings, and Christ never loses. Nobody can refute a truly Christ-filled life. I ran across a story about a gentleman by the name of Martin Niemöller as I was preparing this sermon. And it struck me as a good example of a Christ-filled man standing against the forces of evil. Niemöller was a Protestant pastor in Germany who opposed Hitler from Hitler's earliest years. And when the Nazis began their campaign against Jews, one of their first measures was to require Jews to wear a yellow star, the yellow Star of David, into their clothes. It seemed like a small thing when it started, but it was the first step in a journey that would result in the execution of 6 million Jews. And when Niemöller heard about the edict requiring Jews to wear the Star of David, he announced to his congregation at church that before any one of us can say the Apostles' Creed, we now have to wear a star too, to show their support for the Jews. You know, upon reading that story, I wanted to know more, so I started doing some investigation and checking. And I learned that Niemöller had served as a submarine captain during the First World War. And after the war, he found God and became a Lutheran pastor. And when Hitler required pastors to read pro-government proclamations from the pulpit, Niemöller refused. And when Hitler targeted Christian pastors of Jewish ancestry, which there were only a few in Germany, Niemöller opposed him. So the Nazis went and bombed his house, and Hitler had him put in prison. First it was for a few months, and then he had him put in prison again, and again, and again. And Niemöller's friends, they offered to smuggle him out of the country, but he refused. He wanted to stay. And then in 1937, Hitler imprisoned Niemöller in a concentration camp. First, he went to one called Sachsenhausen. Okay, I can't say this. We're going to try it. Sachsenhausen? Does that sound right? Then he went to Dachau. At one point, a man who Niemöller had known in the Navy saw him in one of the camps. And he said, "Niemöller, why are you in prison?" And Niemöller responded to him, "Why are you not?" In 1945, in April 1945, Niemöller was slated for execution. That's the month that the Nazis executed the better-known Dietrich Bonhoeffer as well. But American soldiers, they liberated Niemöller before the execution could be carried out. He was skin and bones, dying of starvation. And after his release, Niemöller was reunited with his wife, who had suffered during his 8-year imprisonment. Both Niemöller and his family suffered greatly because of his courageous stand against Hitler. Now, sometime later, while he was teaching after the war, a student asked Niemöller how things had gotten so badly out of hand. And this was his response. He said, "First, they came for the communists, but I was not a communist, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the socialists and the trade unionists, but I was neither, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the Jews, But I was not a Jew, so I did not speak out. And when they came for me, there was no one left to speak out for me. You know, you might ask, what did Niemöller accomplish? His family, they suffered terribly because of his opposition of Hitler. And he nearly died in prison. You might think he might have been better off if he just kept his mouth shut and he worked quietly in the background. Spend those 8 years in the pulpit instead of a prison cell. Father John McKenzie, a Catholic priest, he was asked a question like that, and he replied with this. He said, there were some people under Hitler's domination who simply refused to cooperate with what they recognized as evil, and they were executed for it. That's a positive, valid way of living the gospel. But it doesn't work, he said. The Father continued, he said, the thing about following Jesus is that you don't do the right thing because it works. You do the right thing because it's the right thing. Jesus put it this way. He said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. And whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. You know, my friends, I hope that you will never find yourself face to face with that kind of monstrous evil, the kind that Niemöller faced. But it could happen. Christians are suffering persecution in many nations around the world right now. Tens of thousands of Christians will die this year because of their faith. I think that it is likely that we will find out what it feels like to suffer for our faith. One day, we each will be facing something. We can expect to face tough choices because of our faith. You know, our employers, they might expect us to shade the truth to improve the quarterly report. Or maybe our friends will expect us to do things that we just know in our heart are wrong. And then they're going to ridicule us because we refuse. We're going to be tempted to cheat on our taxes. Because, you know, everybody does it, don't they? Just everybody does it. We're going to face 1,000 temptations. And each one of them are going to be cloaked in the deceit that our decisions, they don't really matter. And when faced with such temptations, remember the words that the priest said. The thing about following Jesus is that you don't do the right thing because it works. You do it because it's the right thing. And remember the words of Jesus. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. That's the purpose. To save lives. Ours and others. The self-denial and cross-bearing do not have suffering as their purpose, but life. Let me close by offering you a blessing. Now, these words are those of a gentleman by the name of Unamuno, and he was a Spanish author. And he knew what it was to suffer for doing the right thing. He criticized the king of Spain and was driven out into exile. He criticized Franco, and he was placed under arrest, and he died in prison. And this is the blessing he offers us. He says, may God deny you peace and give you glory. You know, there's a part of me that wants God to give you a peaceful life, a trouble-free life, a life where everything will always go right. However, there's another part of me that knows that life is seldom neatly packaged, is it? And so I pray that God might deny you peace. And I pray that God might instead give you glory. In the name of the Father, the Son, and